Hello, I want to talk to you today about self-care. This is a very important topic for parents. I know it's always been a very important topic for me because I had a lot of trouble with self-care when my children were younger. I overdid things, I pushed myself too hard, I responded constantly to their desires for attention and affection, and they're having their needs met, and I just got completely exhausted. I got completely overwhelmed, and I got really run down. So self-care was something I really needed to focus on, and I've spent quite a lot of time trying to work out what are the most effective forms of self-care. And that's what I want to share with you today. I always wanted, when my children were younger, when I was experiencing this sense of overwhelm and exhaustion, I wanted to get away from them. I wanted to focus on the sorts of self-care that actually meant me time away from them, time to rest, time to just have some quiet for myself. And of course, those types of self-care are really important. And I still love that. I still love having breaks from my children and from the family. And I go for walks on the beach. I go for bushwalks. I meet up with friends, or I go shopping, or I do some exercise. All of those things are really important, but they weren't enough. They weren't enough for me to really deal with my deep exhaustion and feelings of overwhelm, particularly since I was home educating my children and I was with them all day, every day. I needed something more profound, more radical to sustain me, to make this home education journey, and this time spent with my children, I needed to make it more joyful, more relaxed, easier. I needed something to make it easier. So I needed to find a really effective way of caring for myself in this process. And there are three things that I've found to be the most effective forms of self-care, and I just want to share those briefly with you today. The first one is meditation. I've meditated for many, many years now, but before you think, I can't do that, I can't focus, I don't have quiet space or anything like that, the sort of meditation that I practice doesn't require me to be away from my children. It doesn't require me to have sort of separate time where I can sit on my own in a quiet room. That's really nice, but it's not necessary. What I mean when I'm talking about meditation is really just time spent with an inwards focus rather than focusing out on what's going around me in the world. And taking time to focus within can happen any time. It can happen when I'm doing the washing up. It can happen when I'm sitting on the toilet. It could happen when I'm watching my children play, or, you know, just tidying up around the house. Any of those sort of activities can work with an inner focus. Even driving in the car, you know, you can actually focus on the road and what's going on inside you at the same time. That takes a little bit of practice though. So when I focus inwards, obviously the first thing that comes into focus is thoughts. You know, there's all these thoughts inside. So any type of meditation, the most effective type of meditation is one that focuses you inwards but helps focus attention away from thoughts. This is really important. So you don't want to get caught up focusing on your thoughts. You want to focus away from thoughts. So some people meditate by focusing on their breath. Some people focus on a mantra. Some people focus on a guided meditation. My preferred form of meditation is actually to focus on what I call my inner energy field. Now, this is actually just the sense of tingling aliveness inside my body. And you can get a feel for it if you rub your hands together like this or shake them and then focus on the feeling in your hands. You can feel a sort of tingling aliveness. Well, through practice, I've actually learned to sense that aliveness throughout the inside of my body. And when I focus on that sensation inside my body, it's a really, really lovely way to draw my attention away from thoughts and go into a meditative state where my mind is quite calm. I can still be doing things. I can still be even talking to people, but there's this inner sense of calm because the thoughts have dropped away. So I encourage you to find a form of meditation that suits you, and it can really help bring calm into your day, and it can also become a source of spiritual discovery once you discover who you are when you're not thinking. So it can actually really lead to an awakening of into awareness and into your true self that can transform the way you live your life. So the best form of self-care is something that isn't just a coping mechanism, but can really bring deep transformation into your life. And I've found that meditation can do that. So the second form of self-care that I've found very effective is actually not something I do. It's not a practice. It's more a developed understanding. And it's an understanding of fear and anxiety and how they actually work, how the mind works to generate fear. So the reason this is so important, obviously, is that if we're driven by fear and anxiety, again, we worry, we push our children, we push ourselves, even just the experience of a lot of fear in our body can be extremely tiring and exhausting. So anything that exhausts us is something to focus on, to minimize, to dissolve in order to care for ourselves. So when I say understanding, it's like I first got this when I read Eckhart Tolle many years ago, and he talks about two sorts of fear. Firstly, there is the fear you experience when you're in immediate physical danger. So you're about to put your hand on the stove and you sense the heat and you pull away. There's an instinctive reaction to immediate physical danger. If your child is about to run on the street or has run on the street, you yell, you grab them, you run, you do whatever you need to in the moment as an instinctive reaction to that physical danger. So that's a really useful sort of fear. And it's maybe not even fear, it's like this instinctive reaction. The other sort of fear is psychological fear. And this is quite different to the immediate danger fear. And this is what really exhausts us and eats away at our quality of life. So what happens when psychological fear is something happens in our environment or in our family. So to give you an example, it might be something happening with our child. Our child may be playing video games all day, or they may be eating heaps of sweets and junk food. So there's a circumstance that's happening, and then the mind gets to work on that and it judges that situation as something we don't like, something negative, it pulls up data from the past where we've experienced something negative around this in the past, or we've heard people talking about it, or we've heard what happened to them or their kids. So we've got these stories being pulled up from the past, and what the mind does is it actually projects these negative judgments into the future. So we then get a story being generated in our own mind about what might happen in the future if this continues. And this can become absolutely terrifying. You know, it's like a movie is playing in your head where you're imagining this future scenario where terrible things are happening. You know, your child is not learning, or they're addicted to gaming and they don't speak to you anymore, or they're still eating all this junk food and their health is deteriorating, and you know, all sorts of terrible stories are playing in your head about what might happen. And this really scares us, and it drives us into conflict with our children, because we then try and fix them or change them or stop what they're doing because we're terrified of this future scenario. The catch is, of course, that the future scenario is fiction. When we're experiencing psychological fear, we are being scared by a scary story, by an imagined future that isn't real. The only thing that's real is what's right here, right now. Everything else is a story. And even though we're used to projecting into the future all the time, these scary stories, this imagined psychological fear, does far more harm than good, far more harm. And it brings us into terrible conflict. It can destroy relationships, and it can eat away at our own well-being. So understanding how fear works and noticing these games the mind plays to create these movies has been so important to me in living a peaceful life. And if I don't understand what's happening with the mind, then I don't have any perspective on it. I'm not able to see it for what it is. But once I understand it, then I notice it. I notice the patterns. I notice what's going on, and I don't buy into it. I don't put energy into those scary stories anymore. Even though they still arise, they don't get a grip on me the way they used to. So that understanding of how fear works, how the mind works to generate this psychological fear, has been profound. It's had a profound effect on my well-being, and it's a wonderful form of self-care to really notice what the mind is doing and how it's generating fear that isn't real, and how I'm being scared by a fictional story. So the third type of self-care that I've found to be very, very effective is quieting self-judgment. And self-judgment is something that was devastating for me. I mean, it was a pattern that I felt acutely and chronically over a long period of time. This sense that I wasn't good enough, that I wasn't doing enough, that I was somehow unworthy. And I know this is a very, very common pattern amongst lots of people I know. So there's nothing unique about this at all. And because it's so common, this is why I want to share about the importance of actually noticing this pattern and finding a way of quieting those self-judgments. Now, for parents, it tends to be particularly harsh because we take on this role as a parent, and along with the role, there are all these stories about how we've got to be a good mother or a good father, and how we have responsibility for the health and well-being of our children. And these stories are part of this role. It's like part of this program that we take on when we become a parent. It's all learned, it's all cultural, it's all these expectations that come into our minds. And the problem is we judge ourselves against this fictional standard, this concept that is unattainable. So if you're trying to be a good mother, and I was constantly judging myself against this standard, it's impossible. You can never be a good enough mother. The mind is always coming in with more dissatisfaction, with more judgment. You're not doing enough. You're not saying the right things. Your children aren't behaving well enough, or they're not healthy enough. And therefore, because you're responsible, you're not enough. You're not fixing it. You're not caring for them well enough. You know, it just goes on and on and on. And the result of that self-judgment, I mean, it feels exhausting. It feels devastating. It's demoralizing. And it also generates conflict, because you push yourself and then you get overtired, you get grumpy, you start to fight with your children and your husband, and everything just deteriorates. So any practice you can find that will help quieten those self-judgments is a wonderful form of self-care. And the one that I have turned to over and over again over the years is using the work of Byron Katie. I talk about this a lot because it is the number one practice that has helped me dissolve these stories about not being good enough and being responsible to fix all these problems around me, all these other people. And I use it regularly. It's sort of become internalized now as part of my my sort of background thinking. When I notice that story come up, that I'm not doing enough, or I'm not good enough, the questions of the work, you know, is it true? Can you absolutely know it's true? And how do you react when you believe that thought? The questions rise up to meet those stories, those stressful thoughts that are running in my head, and they just fall away. They don't have a grip on me anymore. So learning how to question the self-judgments and the negative self-talk and really quieten that down, pull the energy out of it, has been a really profound form of self-care. And again, these forms of self-care are not just about coping. They're about transforming your life and being able to get into the flow of life without all this mind noise getting in the way. When that mind noise, when those scary stories start to let you go, that's when you can really relax and enjoy being with your children. Enjoy this time you have, this precious time with these young people. So I really, really encourage you to explore those deeper forms of self-care that involve going within and doing a bit of self-work, inner work on the self, to dissolve some of the stressful stories and beliefs. Thanks very much for listening, and I hope you found it helpful. Bye.